They told you not to ask what happened on Claymore Street. They said the old boarding house was gone, burned down in 1913, nothing left but ash, smoke, and silence. But what they didn't say, what they'll never say, is what they found beneath the floorboards. A hidden door, a scent that didn't belong to this world, and a room no builder ever admitted to creating. For decades it was just a whisper, a caution, a local superstition passed between trembling mouths. The guests who arrived but were never seen again, names signed in the ledger but never crossed out, voices that vanished like mist, prayers left hanging unanswered in the night air. But I need you to understand, this isn't folklore, and it's not a haunting. This is a pattern, one that repeats, one that adapts, one that survives inside rituals you were taught to trust. This is about obedience dressed as hospitality, control disguised as care, darkness wearing the mask of grace. In 1891, Clara Hightower was praised across 3 counties, a widow of a senator, no children, no heirs, no visible sin. Just soft-spoken scripture, fresh bread, and a cup of her hand-brewed jasmine tea for every guest who came to rest under her roof. Ministers called her a blessing, women called her a healer, and no one questioned the quiet. But what entered that house didn't come from scripture. It came from something older, something colder, something that fed not on blood, but on consent, something that didn't need to harm you, just needed you to surrender, willingly, and people did. They walked in with pain in their hearts and left nothing behind, not even footprints, because the house didn't let go. It consumed. Not with rage, but with ritual. Now I ask you, are you the kind of man who wants to know, or the kind who prefers the comfort of not knowing? Because once I open this door for you, it cannot be closed. You're already past the point of warning. You're in the hall now, and the wallpaper is breathing. The first time Clara said the words, "He's not missing. He's being prepared." Clara Hightower had a gift, that's what they said. She could see when a person was close to breaking, and she called it a blessing. Said pain was just the soul getting louder, trying to speak before it collapsed under the weight of everything it carried. And her home, she said, was a place where that voice could finally be heard. She wore dark dresses and soft perfume. She prayed before meals and read passages from the Book of Psalms as if they were lullabies. And every guest believed her, because she never rushed them, never judged them, never asked for money. Just silence, rest, obedience, and trust. Her house on Claymore Street stood taller than the rest. 3 stories of white wood and grey shutters, ivy climbing up the walls like fingers reaching for heaven. And every room was carefully arranged, each with a small Bible, a wooden cross, a porcelain cup steeped in tea that smelled like flowers, and something deeper, something sweet and dizzying. They said the dream started on the 3rd night. Vivid, strange, full of light that had no source, faces that floated just beyond memory, voices repeating phrases that didn't make sense, but felt ancient, heavy, carved into the bones. And by the 5th night, the guests had changed. They stopped asking questions. They stopped writing letters. They spent long hours staring out the windows, as if watching something no one else could see. And when townspeople passed the house, they said it looked calm, too calm, like time moved slower on that property, like the house was breathing its own air. But one woman did notice, and she didn't look away. Her name was Rachel Bell, the sister of a travelling reverend who checked in on a Sunday and never preached another sermon. Rachel came looking with a half-finished letter in her pocket, and the last words her brother ever wrote. "Clara understands me. Finally someone sees what I really am. I feel like I'm standing at the edge of something holy." Rachel arrived in early July, a heat wave thick in the air, the kind that makes shadows stretch too far and flies circle too slow. And from the moment she stepped onto that porch, she felt it. Not fear exactly, but something worse. The feeling that someone already knew her name before she said it aloud. And when Clara opened the door, smiling like she'd been expecting her, Rachel knew. Something was wrong, and it had already begun. The house was cooler than it should have been, not from shade or breeze, but from something deeper, something beneath the walls, like the temperature dropped because the house wanted it that way. Rachel stepped inside and smelled roses and vinegar, and something faintly metallic, like rust or blood left too long in water. Clara offered her tea, of course, jasmine with hints of ginger, and something that coated the throat like honey and ash. She declined, and Clara's smile flickered, just for a second, like a small calculation had failed to complete. Then came the hospitality, gentle questions, soft tones, hands folded just so, and the invitation to stay the night. No charge, she insisted. It's what God would want, especially for family. But Rachel didn't sleep, not really. She lay on the bed with her shoes still on, listening, waiting, watching the way the moonlight fell across the hallway outside her door. And just before dawn, she heard it. A low sound, almost like singing, but slower, deeper, with syllables that didn't belong to any language she knew. She followed it barefoot, careful not to make the floorboards cry out, down the stairs, past the parlour, toward the kitchen, and beyond that a doorway she hadn't seen before. It was narrow, half concealed behind a cabinet that had been slid aside just enough to allow passage, and beyond it, the stairs to the cellar. They were old stone steps, slick with damp, the air getting colder with each descent. She held her breath at first, but then the smell changed, from sweet to rotting, from floral to earth. And when she reached the bottom, the sound stopped. There were candles burning in shallow alcoves, dozens of them, flickering against walls carved with shapes that made her eyes ache, circles, lines, mirrored crosses, and something that looked like an eye split down the middle. And on the far end of the room, a table covered in linen, and on that table, something wrapped in cloth, not moving but not empty. She reached for it, hands shaking, and pulled back the fabric. Beneath it, a body, eyes closed, dressed in black, hands folded, skin waxy and cold. Her brother. Only his chest. It rose and fell, slow and shallow, like he was trapped in a dream he couldn't wake from. And beside him, a card written in Clara's hand. Arrival, June 27th, transition pending. Rachel didn't scream. She couldn't, because just then behind her someone exhaled, and the candles began to go out one by one. Rachel didn't turn around right away. Something in her body wouldn't let her, like a voice under her ribs whispering, "Not yet. Not now. Wait." The air behind her had thickened, heavy like syrup, too still for breath, too wrong for life. And when she finally turned, she saw nothing. No figure, no shadow, just the open door and the staircase beyond it, pulsing faintly like it too had lungs, and it too was waiting. She took her brother's hand. It was cold but not lifeless, and she whispered his name once, twice, and then his eyelids fluttered, just barely, like something heard her, but not him. She leaned in close, too close, and she saw it, a faint smile forming on his lips. Not peaceful, not familiar, but distant and devoted, like a man kneeling at the altar of something ancient and cruel. She stepped back fast and nearly knocked over the table, and that's when she saw them, the others, 7 shapes under white sheets, each with a name card, each with a scent, sage, rosewater, sulphur. One of the cards said Elizabeth Truitt, and Rachel remembered that name, a woman who vanished in '89 after attending a spiritual retreat led by Clara Hightower. Rachel didn't run, she walked, slow, careful steps back toward the stairs, but the door at the top had closed, not slammed, not locked, just closed, gently, like it was never open in the first place. And then she heard Clara's voice, clear and calm and close. "You shouldn't be here, Rachel. Not yet. You've seen what isn't yours to carry. But that doesn't mean it's too late to understand." Rachel pressed her back against the wall, heart thundering, and said nothing. And Clara continued, They come to me because they're tired, because the world takes more than it gives, because pain is louder than love. And I offer them silence. I offer them stillness. I offer them surrender. And when they're ready, I give them. The final piece no preacher dares preach, Rachel shouted. What did you do to my brother? And Clara answered, I unburdened him, I prepared him, and soon he'll be ready. He's closer than ever. Rachel found the strength to move, to run, to force the door open and flee barefoot into the night air. But the house stayed behind her, glowing faintly in the dark, humming like a prayer sung backwards. And her brother's smile followed her into every dream after that. Rachel didn't go to the sheriff, not because she didn't want to, but because she knew he wouldn't help. She had seen his name in the ledger, tucked in the back pages, signed under the word donor. And when she walked past the chapel that Sunday, she saw him praying beside Clara Hightower, eyes closed, hands trembling, mouthing words that didn't sound like scripture. The whole town, it seemed, was stitched together by her. Women who smiled too wide, men who walked too slow, children who stared at things that weren't there. She'd sewn herself into the fabric of their routines, their rituals, their relief. And now Rachel was the only thread out of place. She went to the only man she trusted, a coroner named Elias Wren, a widower who had once lost a daughter in that same boarding house, years before it became holy. He never spoke of it, but when Rachel told him what she saw, he didn't flinch, didn't ask if it was real. He just poured 2 glasses of rye and pulled a rusted key from a box beneath his floor. He said there's something buried behind the chapel, something no map shows and no preacher dares mention. He said if you want answers, that's where the rot begins. They waited until nightfall, the town still half asleep in its soft gospel trance, and walked with no light down the gravel path behind the chapel garden, past the statues of saints whose faces had worn smooth from decades of rain, and through a gate that hadn't been opened in years. Behind it, buried beneath dead grass and the bones of forgotten sermons, was a cellar door sunk into the earth. The key fit too easily, like the lock had never been real, just symbolic. And what waited below wasn't dust and wood, but stone and silence. They descended into a chamber carved like a cathedral, its walls lined with altars, not of gold but of teeth, of locks of hair, of jars filled with dark fluid and papper, air prayers folded 100 times, and in the centre, a stone basin marked with names. Rachel's brother was one of them, Elias's daughter too, and dozens more, etched deep into the surface like they'd always been there, waiting to be found. And at the bottom of that basin, under candlelight that never flickered, was a single phrase burned into the stone. He who offers stillness becomes the gate. Elias stepped back and whispered, This isn't faith. This is structure. Rachel stared at the basin like it was breathing, like the words carved into its stone were not written but grown, like something beneath the chapel had been feeding on worship for decades. And now it had a name, a design, a purpose that no one dared to say aloud. Elias knelt beside it, not out of reverence, but out of recognition. He traced one of the names with his fingertip, and his hand began to tremble, not from fear, but memory. He said this isn't the first time someone has used comfort to control. It's just the first time they made it look like love. He opened his satchel and pulled out a page, yellowed, fragile, a hand-drawn map of Claymore before the town was built. It showed a network beneath the soil, not of tunnels, but of points, marked with initials and strange sigils, each one corresponding to a property where disappearances had occurred since 1824. At the center of them all, marked with a perfect circle, and the letter H, was the boarding house. Rachel whispered, How long has this been happening? And Elias answered, As long as people have begged for peace, more than they've searched for truth. He said the basin was part of an older rite, one that predates the churches, one that was brought over not by missionaries, but by secret societies that knew how to bind belief into obedience. Clara hadn't created the ritual. She had inherited it, perfected it, learned how to hide it beneath blankets, tea and psalms. And those jars of liquid, they weren't just symbolic, they were records, fragments of will, of identity, preserved for something bigger. Elias said they called it the stillness, a process by which the soul could be fractured, emptied and used. Used for what? Rachel asked, and he said the word slowly. Containment. She didn't understand, not yet. But something in her knew the truth was coming, not in words, but in weight. The kind that bends time around it, the kind that makes a room feel smaller the longer you stay. They took one jar, one with her brother's initials etched in red, and they left the basin behind. But as they rose from the depths, the candles did not flicker. They went out all at once, as if something had noticed the theft, and in that darkness, for the first time, Rachel felt it. Not fear, not sorrow, but intent, watching her, choosing her, choosing. Not everyone who entered Clara Hightower's house disappeared. Some left weeks or months later, but they never spoke of their stay, never looked the same, never walked the same. Their faces slack, their eyes empty but alert, like something else had taken up residence just behind the glass of their gaze. They returned to their lives, mostly. Back to farms, back to families, back to pulpits and courtrooms, but those closest to them could feel the shift, could sense the distance, like the person they loved had been replaced by a perfect imitation that remembered everything except why it mattered. Elias had tracked these people for years, catalogued them, studied their behavior. Their routines became mechanical, their speech filtered, reduced. They no longer spoke in opinions, only quotations. No desires, only duties. They stopped dreaming, stopped arguing, stopped mourning the things they used to grieve. He called them the returned. Not survivors, not victims. Just shells that had been calibrated to pass unnoticed. Rachel watched one of them herself, a teacher named Mary Whitlow, once vibrant, now quiet, her eyes scanning the church pews every Sunday like she was taking attendance for someone else. Mary had once been her mother's friend, had taught Rachel how to read, and now she looked through her like memory itself had been unplugged. Rachel asked her one afternoon, "Do you remember what Clara said to you before you left?" And Mary smiled, that same vacant, too even smile that all the returned wore, and she said, "Clara didn't say, she offered, and I accepted, and now the ache is gone." Rachel pressed harder. "What ache? What did she take from you?" But Mary's voice grew softer, smaller, as she whispered, "The ache that made me human." It was that night Rachel realized what Clara was really doing. Not just preserving people, not just silencing them, but tearing out the noise of pain, the noise of self, the conflict that makes us real. She was turning people into clean vessels, obedient instruments, perfectly still, perfectly safe. But safe for what? And safe from who? Elias told her the next step wasn't the house. It was the hospital, the one Clara donated to just 2 years before she opened her boarding house, the one where records vanished, staff disappeared, and all funding came from the same anonymous trust. He said the boarding house was just the first gate. The real work was being done in the rooms they never let you see. The hospital was called St. Aurelia's Home for Convalescents. Soft name, quiet reputation, a place for rest and recovery tucked into the Pinewood Hills 12 miles north of town. No scandal, no protests, no headlines, just patients admitted and slowly forgotten, like names written in water. It had been closed for 17 years, the building left to rot under vines and moss, the windows boarded, the walls split from moisture. But the name still whispered in council meetings and church basements, a name associated with peace, transformation, miracles that no doctor could explain and no priest could verify. Elias still had keys. How he got them he never said. And on a night where the moon refused to rise, they passed through the iron gates with the words, "Rest in light," carved overhead, and the second they crossed the threshold, Rachel felt it. The same pressure she had felt in Clara's house, but older, denser, not watching her but listening. The hallways were choked in dust and silence, but the deeper they went, the cleaner it became, less decay, more preservation, until they reached the lowest floor, where the tile gleamed like bone and the walls bore no signs of time. There were rooms without doors, corridors that looped into themselves, symbols etched into vents and floorboards, a layout designed not for efficiency, but for containment, for ritual. And at the center of it all, they found the files. Dozens of them, untouched, sealed in wax, marked with initials that matched the ledger from Clara's house, patient files but none of them sick, psychological evaluations that read like scripture, detailing dreams, confessions, beliefs, and most importantly, surrender. Each subject had undergone a final stage marked only by a single word: inversion. Rachel opened one folder and found a photo. Her brother, strapped to a gurney, not restrained but offer. D. Eyes closed, mouth curved in that same strange smile. The one that said, "I found peace because I no longer belong to myself." Elias said the rituals here had been older than the staff, that Clara didn't invent the system. She was a continuation, a conductor, a chosen practitioner of an older doctrine passed through institutions disguised as charity. And this was the part that sickened Rachel most. It had worked, not just once, not just on the week. It had worked on dozens, maybe hundreds, and no one noticed, because the world loves quiet people. The world rewards stillness, even when it's manufactured. They found the doctrine inside a locked drawer behind the administrator's desk. Not typed, not bound, but handwritten, page after page of ritual phrasing, old Creole symbols blended with Latin, instructions that read like a blueprint for spiritual surgery. The title scrawled across the first page: The Covenant of the Third Silence. Elias flipped through the pages like he'd seen them before, his hands shaking slightly, his lips mouthing fragments, not prayers but permissions. Phrases like "offer what burdens you most" and "no peace without preparation." And always repeated 3 times was a name, not a person, but a force, older than any saint, older than any faith. Elatha, Rachel asked what it meant. And Elias said it wasn't a name to say out loud, not because of superstition, but because it wasn't meant to be heard. It was meant to be felt. Spoken only at the edge of surrender. When a person had been emptied of everything but will, he said, the covenant promised release, promised freedom from pain, from thought, from memory. It was an instruction manual for how to remove the self without dying. And Clara, she'd only been the latest to use it. The documents referenced others: boarding houses, orphanages, monasteries, places that called themselves sanctuaries but operated like slow-burning machines of personality erosion. Rachel saw in one note the phrase, "Still the soul and the gate shall open." And below it, "Those who return are tools. Those who stay are vessels, but those who offer without fear shall lead." She stepped back and realized the pattern. Clara hadn't been collecting people, she'd been sorting them, preparing them for stages of utility, turning human will into ritual energy for something she believed was higher, holier, beyond flesh. But one page changed everything. It wasn't doctrine, it was a letter from Clara herself, written in 1887, an address int. "To someone called the curator," she wrote, "I have found a location with the right resonance. The soil is compliant, the townsfolk willing, the pain dense enough to distill. Once the structure is complete, I will begin the harvesting." Rachel looked up at Elias and asked the only question that mattered now. How far has this spread? And Elias, without looking at her, simply said, "Farther than even she realized, because Clara may be dead, but the system is still alive, and it's looking for new silence to feed on." They didn't go back to the house that night. Not because they were afraid, but because they knew now that the house wasn't the source. It was a satellite, a gathering node. One small arm of something older and larger, hidden in plain sight, under the language of charity and rest. Rachel sat at Elias's kitchen table while he unfolded maps, not just of Tennessee, but the entire southeastern corridor. And on each map, he marked locations that matched the same architecture, the same funding patterns, the same founding dates. 1883, 1901, 1927. Always under the guise of healing, retreat, sanctuary. He said they weren't random. They formed a lattice, a design, one that mimicked the very geometry she had seen on the basement floor. Spirals, mirrored lines, circular structures that all bled into a central axis he hadn't yet located. He believed that axis was somewhere deep in federal land, somewhere not listed on public records, somewhere under protection so old and high up that even mayors and senators didn't know who signed the original deed. Rachel asked, "Who built this?" And Elias said it wasn't built, it was planted. Slowly, over decades, with doctrine hidden as policy and obedience hidden as therapy. She asked if the government was involved, and he said no, not directly. This thing moves beneath government, the way roots move beneath houses, slow, patient, and inevitable. He said you'll find it anywhere people seek relief without resistance, where the pain is numbed instead of solved, where the institutions promise quiet but never ask why the soul is screaming. And the more she listened, the more Rachel realized something terrifying. This wasn't just about Clara or Claymore or even Tennessee. It was about a blueprint for spiritual sterilization, rolled out town by town, generation by generation, a psychological blackout dressed up as mercy. And if Elias was right, then each of these facilities, each church-turned-clinic, each mission-turned-boarding house, wasn't just a place to rest. It was a gate, and every person who passed through it became either a part of the gate or part of what was sealed behind it. Because the stillness wasn't just a ritual, it was a control system, and somewhere, someone was still running it. Rachel sent letters first, not emails, not calls, but paper untraceable, addressed to journalists, to archivists, to a retired theology professor in Virginia who once published a banned dissertation titled The Architecture of Obedience. She mailed photocopies of Clara's notes, maps of the spiral alignments, even the letter to the curator. Then she waited. 2 weeks passed. Then the silence began to shift. The professor never replied, but her obituary appeared 3 days later, a quiet passing in her sleep, no foul play suspected. One journalist emailed back once, asking if Rachel had access to the original artifacts, before his inbox went dark and his name vanished from the outlet's masthead. The archivist called her directly, a woman named Hester Bloomfield. Her voice calm but strained, like she was speaking while being watched. She said, "I read everything, and I believe you, but don't send anything else. They already came to the house. They didn't knock." Then she hung up. And that night, Rachel found a car parked outside her apartment, engine off, windows dark. It stayed there from midnight until 4:03 a.m., then drove off without headlights. She went to Elias with everything, and he wasn't surprised. He said the system doesn't hide through brute force, it hides through absurdity. If you say the truth out loud, people dismiss you as broken. It's not suppression, it's discrediting. They make the truth taste like madness, so no one swallows it. Rachel wanted to keep fighting, wanted to go louder, but Elias warned her. He said Clara was just a brick in the cathedral, just one gatekeeper. But what stood behind her, what she fed with ritual and surrender, it didn't want to be seen. Not because it was weak, but because it was patient. It wanted belief, not exposure. It wanted people to come willingly, to ask for the stillness themselves, because only those who asked could be emptied without resistance, and Rachel was now marked, not just as a witness, but as an interruption. He told her she had one chance left to decide, to go silent, disappear on purpose, or go public and watch everything she loves decay in front of her piece by piece, because the stillness doesn't need to kill you, it just needs to remove what made you matter. Rachel didn't run. She didn't disappear. She chose the third path, the one the stillness feared most, confrontation without fear. Elias gave her the final piece, a location buried in the footnotes of Clara's own writings, cross-referenced with U.S. Geological Survey anomalies from 1841, a place called Varnell's Hollow, Tennessee. It didn't appear on maps anymore, but local hunters still whispered of strange sounds there, of lights without source, of an echo that followed you even when you stood still. They traveled by night, leaving Claymore behind like a dream that no longer held power. Varnell's Hollow was no town. It was a depression in the land, a crater smothered in overgrowth and silence, with the remains of stone columns buried beneath moss and vines, like something was built there long before anyone called the land Tennessee. Elias said this was the source, not of Clara's madness, but of her mission. The stillness began here, not as a belief but as an event. He believed something broke through once, and what followed wasn't an entity but a principle, the concept of containment given form, the idea that peace must come through obedience, that surrender is a gift, and that silence is the highest order of loyalty. Rachel stepped into the center of the hollow, where 7 stone slabs formed a spiral. The same symbol burned into every ritual site from Clara's home to the hospital to the chapel floor. And there, etched in a dialect no human tongue should remember, were 3 lines. Breathe once to forget self, breathe twice to unmake will, breathe thrice and become threshold. She asked Elias, "Who wrote this?" He said, "They didn't write, they left, and we've been decoding their exit plan ever since." Rachel knelt and touched the stone. It vibrated, not with noise, but with something deeper, like a hum beneath time, a rhythm that matched her heartbeat, until it no longer felt like hers. She stood up and said aloud, "This ends with me." But as soon as she did, the ground trembled, not violently but as if awakening, a low frequency that didn't shake trees or scatter birds, but changed thought itself, blurred language, softened resistance. Elias cried out, "Don't speak to it with certainty." But it was too late. The hollow had recognized her, not as a threat, but as a successor. The hollow responded slowly, not with sound but with sensation, like a memory surfacing that wasn't hers, like a dream slipping into her mind from somewhere ancient, older than speech, older than fire. Rachel staggered back from the stone spiral, but the vibration didn't stop. It followed her into her spine, into her breath, until every heartbeat felt like it belonged to someone else. Elias caught her by the shoulders, his eyes wide, not with fear but recognition. He whispered, "It's choosing you because you touched it without begging." She asked, "What does it want from me?" And he said, "To continue. Not the rituals, not the containment, but the process of stilling, of hollowing, of turning human agony into clean, soft obedience." Clara had obeyed it. Elias had resisted it. Rachel now stood in between. The hollow didn't need worship. It needed mirrors. People who could reflect silence back into the world with authority, with purity. Leaders who could speak peace while draining souls one layer at a time. And Rachel was the perfect candidate, wounded enough to be open, angry enough to resist, clear enough to understand exactly what was being asked. The stones around her began to glow, faintly, like coals long buried. And behind her, Elias pulled a flask of holy water from his coat, one blessed by a monk who vanished in 1896 after attempting the same confrontation. He held it over the stones and said, "This is your last chance. Either we desecrate the ritual, or you fulfill it." Rachel looked at the stones, then at Elias, and she asked, "If I destroy it, will it stop everywhere?" And he said the truest words he'd ever spoken, "No, but it'll know someone said no." That's when Rachel made her choice. She stepped into the spiral and knelt again, not in reverence, but in defiance. She whispered 3 words, not written in the doctrine, not blessed by any cathedral. Words her mother once said to her in the dark, words full of pain, of fight, of refusal. I remember everything. And the hollow flinched. For the first time in centuries, something inside it recoiled, not because it was wounded, but because it had been recognized, not as salvation, but as infection. The moment she spoke those words, the wind stopped, not slowed, not calmed, but ceased, as if sound itself had been exiled from the land around her. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even her breath sounded real. Elias stood frozen, staring at the spiral beneath Rachel's feet, its glow dimming, pulsing like a wound struggling to close. And then the stones cracked, not with violence, but with release. The air turned bitter. The sky above them seemed to lower, pressing down like a hand trying to push them back into the earth. And somewhere beyond the tree line, something began to move. Not a figure, not a beast, but an awareness. It wasn't coming toward them. It was simply watching. Rachel collapsed, vision swimming with symbols she'd never learned, memories not hers, names not from this century, and one phrase repeating in a whisper beneath her skin. Containment breached. Elias dragged her back from the center of the spiral just as the last stone crumbled. And by the time they reached the edge of the hollow, the ground had sealed itself behind them, like nothing had happened, like the earth didn't just exhale a truth it had buried for 100 years, but the world around them was no longer the same. When they returned to Claymore, every trace of Rachel's name had been scrubbed, her letters returned unopened, her apartment emptied, her mother's grave replaced by someone else's. At the library, the record of her birth had vanished. At the hospital, no one remembered her brother. The town didn't accuse her, it simply refused to remember her. Even Elias, whose memory ran deeper than the archives, found himself forgetting details, not by choice, but by force, like something was rewriting the timeline from beneath the surface, one thread at a time. And that's when Rachel realized the stillness wasn't just a ritual, or a cult, or a sickness. It was a mechane, a recursive engine that sensed interruption and corrected it, not with violence but with erasure. That's why Clara had lasted so long. Not because she was powerful, but because she followed the blueprint without deviation. But Rachel had refused to become threshold. She had remembered, and in doing so, she had shattered the spell's symmetry. She couldn't rely on history anymore. It was being rewritten in real time. She couldn't rely on institutions. They'd been built to forget. So Rachel turned to the only thing the system couldn't touch directly: story, not official records, not testimony, but whispered tales, fractured rumors, scattered fragments wrapped in folklore. She wrote letters by hand again, but not to journalists or professors. She mailed them to janitors, to nurses, to cemetery groundskeepers, to people who lived in the margins, people the stillness overlooked. Because power always underestimates the ones who mop its floors. Each letter told a version of the truth, not the whole thing, just enough. A strange house in Tennessee, a woman who watched the guests disappear, a ritual of silence that looked like healing, a gate built not from stone but from surrender, and hidden in every story, always in the 7th paragraph, she wrote the phrase twice. I remember everything. I remember everything. She did this for months. No return addresses, no phone numbers, just ink, old paper, and a symbol drawn in the corner of every page. A spiral split down the center, just enough to disturb its perfection. And slowly, something began to change. People she didn't know started using the phrase online, not as hashtags but in poems, in artwork, in sermons, whispered during grief circles and scribbled on train station walls. The stories mutated, evolved. Some added ghosts, others monsters. Some made the boarding house a lighthouse, a cathedral, a roadside motel. But the core truth remained. The memory of stillness had been unshackled from its original form, and that made it dangerous, because symbols, once freed from institutions, don't die. They spread. Elias returned weeks later with something he found in a thrift shop 3 states over, a child's sketchbook, aged at least 30 years, and on the final page, drawn in red crayon, was a spiral cracked in half, and beneath it, "My dreams were not mine until I said no." Rachel didn't cry. She just nodded. Because she knew the truth now. The ritual could be rewritten, not destroyed, but inverted. It no longer mattered if she was remembered. What mattered was that the lie wasn't. It didn't come for her with violence. It came with certainty, the way it always does when it wants obedience to look like truth. New churches appeared, quiet, minimalist, fragrant with myrrh and cedar. No crosses, no stained glass, just spiral-shaped pews and sermons that never mentioned sin, only stillness. They didn't advertise, they didn't recruit, they didn't ask for money, they just opened their doors in forgotten towns, in city corners where people were too tired to question anything anymore. And inside, the message was always the same, spoken in hundreds of different ways. Pain is noise, emotion is disruption, memory is burden. The clergy didn't wear robes. They wore perfect smiles and empty eyes, and their followers weren't fanatics. They were exhausted people, broken in quiet ways, looking for one final silence that didn't feel like death. They called themselves keepers of the third silence. And when Rachel finally stepped into one of their sanctuaries, years after Varnell's Hollow, in a town that hadn't existed on any of her maps, she realized something horrific. The sermon being preached wasn't Clara's, it was hers. Her words, her phrasing, twisted, softened, distorted into a doctrine of release. She sat in the back row, while a woman with a warm voice said, "We remember everything, so you don't have to." And the room nodded, because the lie now wore the face of her rebellion. This is how the system fights, not by resisting you, but by becoming you, by stealing the shape of your truth and filling it with anesthesia. Rachel left the church that night and burned her notes, not out of fear, but because she understood now that the war wasn't about facts, it was about frameworks, the moment her story had entered the collective. It became vulnerable to mutation, and the system had already begun reframing her as its prophet. That's when she knew. If she was going to finish this, she had to erase herself, before they finished recasting her as a saint. Rachel didn't leave a note. She didn't vanish in some dramatic blaze or go underground in a flurry of noise. She simply stepped out of the frame. No aliases, no masks, no digital trail. She became what the stillness feared most, a story with no narrator. Her name dropped off bank ledgers, library systems, university logs. Not because the system erased her this time, but because she let go first. She removed her reflection from the surface of the world, and in doing so became untraceable, not physically but ideologically. Because in a war of belief, identity is the strongest tether and the easiest to twist. She understood that now they wanted her face, her voice, her rage. They wanted to wear it as proof that their doctrine had opposition. Opposition they could frame, contain, mirror, and absorb. But when she disappeared, she took the frame with her. And the silence, for the first time, responded with desperation. Not thunder, not wrath, but confusion. People in distant towns began hearing music in their sleep. Not melodies, but single notes, held too long, unnerving and wrong, like something searching for a frequency it couldn't quite locate. Symbols etched themselves into the bark of trees, into sand swept across desert roads, into the chalk drawings of children with no context. A radio host in Montana started repeating the phrase, "Third silence now open," before passing out mid-broadcast. A bishop in Ohio tore out his own tongue after painting a spiral on the altar and weeping, "I can't speak if she's not seen." They weren't believers, they were receptors. Because when Rachel vanished, she didn't take the truth with her, she unlocked it, and without a host to contain it, the system lost its grip. The stillness had always relied on containment, in books, in people, in rooms, but now its boundaries were bleeding. It was whispering into minds that didn't ask, dreaming into souls that never signed the ritual. And somewhere in the dark, it called out her name. But no one answered, because Rachel wasn't gone. She was everywhere it couldn't reach. He was a janitor at a shuttered seminary in rural Vermont, a man named Hal, 52 years old, divorced, quiet, 2 grown kids who barely called anymore. He didn't believe in much, didn't trust religion, didn't read conspiracy blogs, but he believed in patterns, and he noticed when the basement hallway, the one near the archives no one entered since the fire, began to smell like lavender and iron. He noticed when the door that never opened suddenly sat ajar, just enough to feel like invitation. And inside that room, on a rusted chair beside a collapsed bookshelf, was a single envelope. No name, no address, just a spiral, cracked clean down the middle. Inside the envelope, one sheet of paper, yellowed, almost brittle, and on it, 10 words. What stills you is what feeds it. Walk backward. That night, Hal dreamed of a staircase that never ended, of voices whispering sermons in reverse, of a woman standing in a circle of salt, saying nothing, just watching him, with a look not of threat, but of expectation. When he woke, his hand smelled of fennel, and something deep in his chest whispered, remember, he didn't tell anyone. Who would believe him? But something in him shifted. He stopped listening to music on his commute, sat in silence instead. He stopped watching the news, started reading old letters found in the seminary's walls, sermons from 1891 that spoke of a quiet God with no name and endless hunger. He stopped sleeping through the night, because in the dark, something had started knocking, not on doors, but on his thoughts, and it wasn't asking for belief, it was asking for permission. Then one morning, he found a second envelope, same spiral, same cracked line, but this time, 2 words. Your turn. He didn't panic. He didn't run. He simply walked into the archives, closed the door behind him, and whispered, I remember everything. Twice. No, to summon, but to interrupt, and something shifted again, because the stillness didn't expect him to say it without wanting anything back. No salvation, no healing, no escape. Just refusal. Pure, untwisted, permanent refusal. And for the first time since 1891, the ritual didn't move forward. It stalled because someone walked backward, and meant it. When the ritual stalled, something inside the architecture of stillness cracked. Not at the surface, not in the sermons or sanctuaries, but deep, beneath the places no one was supposed to remember. Old records began surfacing without explanation, shipping manifests from 1889 with blacked-out names, baptism logs from churches that never existed, newspaper clippings with stories of missing congregations that entire counties had no memory of. One vault in Alabama opened itself after nearly a century sealed shut, its floor covered in scorched hymnals, each one open to a page that simply read, We were not supposed to rest. All across the southeast, strange power failures began at exactly 3:33 a.m. Security systems froze, hospital monitors glitched, and in one isolated care home in Georgia, 17 residents woke up from catatonic states, each whispering the same name. Clara. But it wasn't her they were remembering. It was what she sealed. They spoke of basements with no stairs, of mirrors that didn't reflect, of meals served cold with incense thick enough to erase will. They spoke of prayers made backward, of names they were forced to forget before they could scream them, of a stillness that grew teeth. And the more they spoke, the more the staff changed. 3 nurses quit in one day, said they'd heard a chorus humming from the walls and couldn't sleep anymore. One man, a chaplain who'd volunteered for 20 years, was found sitting on the chapel floor with a spiral drawn in blood across his forehead, eyes wide open, unmoving. He hadn't blinked in 17 hours. Investigators found nothing conclusive, but a young nurse found a box hidden beneath the chapel's floorboards. Inside, a lock of silver hair and a letter dated 1893. It was addressed to the curator, and it read, "The containers hold, but not forever. They speak in dreams. They are not dead." Only paused. "Please do not let them finish remembering." The nurse quit that night, but not before mailing a photo of the letter to a P.O. box in Vermont. Hal received it 2 days later, and for the first time since opening that envelope in the seminary basement, he spoke aloud a name he'd only heard in dreams, Rachel. The first to rise was a woman named Elsie Parham. She had died in 1902, buried under a false name in Claymore's pauper field. No obituary, no service, no family listed. But when the wind shifted that August night, 3 counties over, she walked barefoot out of the woods near a shuttered monastery and collapsed on the steps, her skin pale as wax, her mouth whispering. I kept the name hidden, but it wouldn't stay buried. The second was a boy, no older than 12, who appeared at 3:33 a.m. on a traffic camera feed outside Ashland, Kentucky, standing perfectly still at a 4-way intersection. He was wearing a choir robe soaked in old blood, but no wounds. When police arrived, he was gone. But in the center of the intersection, carved into the concrete with surgical precision, were 5 words. We were paused, not saved, and then came the voices, not screaming, not moaning, but singing, from beneath floorboards, from inside abandoned wells, from hospital morgues sealed for decades. They sang hymns no one remembered teaching, in languages no linguist could trace. But every verse followed the same pattern. Still me, still me, still me, until I am no longer me. The containers Clara built weren't graves. They were vaults, holding not just bodies, but echoes. Memories too volatile for clean deletion. Consciousness trapped like flame under glass. Rachel had disrupted the design. Hal had reopened the breach. Now, the ones who had been held for over a century were awakening. Not with forgiveness, not with peace, but with a desperate hunger to be known again, and the stillness. It wasn't designed to handle resurrection. It fed on compliance, on structured ritual, on predictability. But the returned were none of those things. They brought with them fractures, wild memories stitched together wrong, songs missing final notes, prayers that ended in curses. The system began to tear. In its core sanctuaries, followers began speaking out of turn, dreaming of other faces, of walls that pulsed, of rooms that wept, and one by one, keepers of the third silence began to lose their grip, not because they stopped believing, but because they started remembering, and memory, once awakened, cannot be stilled. The original boarding house on Barrow Street had long since been demolished. Nothing stood there now but a crooked patch of earth and a condemned historical marker stripped of all text. The town claimed it had been removed for reconstruction. But Hal found something deeper, not through maps, not through records, but through one final letter, hand-delivered by a stranger in a linen coat who never gave a name. Inside the envelope, a matchbox from a now-closed diner in Claymore, a hand-drawn diagram of the original basement's second level, and 4 words scrawled in the corner. There's a door beneath the door. Hal knew the spiral was tightening. He left that night. No luggage, no warning, just one flashlight, one crowbar, and Rachel's last fragment. A torn page from her field journal, water-damaged, half-legible, ending with the line, "They weren't trying to keep us in. They were keeping something else out." The ruins of the Duval house were guarded only by rusted wire and signs that warned of unstable ground. Hal didn't hesitate. He followed the old stones of the original cellar wall, marked with spirals too faint for the human eye. But his hands felt them, like scars under stone. He found the hatch buried beneath a slab of rotted flooring, and beneath that, exactly as Rachel had written, a second door, not wood, not steel, but bone, thousands of pieces, lacquered and pressed, shaped into a barrier bound by red twine and sealed with a phrase, "Break only if you are not afraid to become the key." Hal broke it because he was afraid, but he wasn't obedient. The chamber beneath wasn't a room. It was a vault of breath, a space that responded to intrusion, not with traps, but with memory. He staggered as the air turned to incense, and a voice, not Rachel's, not Clara's, whispered into his mind, "You are late." On the walls, handprints, child-sized, elder-sized, pressed into the clay like pleas. Some bled, some glowed, and at the far end a pillar made not of stone but of prayer books, burned black, stacked to the ceiling, each marked with the same sigil, a spiral, cracked, split, bleeding. Hal stepped forward, heart racing, because what lay sealed beneath those books wasn't doctrine, it was origin, and it had just begun to wake up. It didn't speak in words, it spoke in realizations, moments Hal had never lived but suddenly remembered, as if history had poured into his spine like ink into paper. He saw hospitals that never healed, churches that converted without sermons. He saw rooms lined with mirrors that didn't reflect the body, only the soul, flickering, drained, replaced. And in every image, always, the spiral, not as a symbol, but as a mechanism. This was not a demon, not a curse, not even a spirit. It was a system, older than scripture, more patient than time, not designed to punish, but to optimize, to refine, to simplify humanity into a form more manageable, more docile, more programmable, emotion. A glitch to be resolved, memory, a burden to be archived, desire, a frequency to be muted until it vibrated with utility and obedience. The only stable state, this was the true stillness. Not a religion, but a psychological architecture, tested for centuries in monasteries, in boarding houses, in orphan asylums no one remembers. Under the guise of faith, under the banner of peace. But always, beneath the rituals, was the algorithm. Isolate, still, replicate. And Hal? He wasn't a hero. He was a variable, an unplanned anomaly who had resisted the quiet. And the system was now running a correction protocol. The prayer books began to hum. One by one, they lit from within. Not flames, but pulses of data. Every false salvation ever whispered by Clara, by the keepers, by every echo that ever taught silence as a virtue. And above it all, something massive stirred, not a figure, not even a presence, just an awareness. It knew Hal now. It saw him, and it asked him a question not with language, but with pressure. Will you trade your memory for peace? Because that's all it ever wanted. Not death, not worship, just the quieting of noise, the taming of thought, the smoothing of will. But Hal Wesar remembered Rachel's words, and he whispered them into the archive's throat, not once, but twice. I remember everything. I remember everything. The ground shuddered. Not from rage, but from failure, because the moment someone remembers without fear, the loop breaks, and for the first time in over 130 years, the system stuttered. Across the country, the collapse began quietly. A seminary in Ohio lost power during morning prayer. The stained glass spirals shattered inward, not from force, but from rejection, as if the building itself no longer believed in its own walls. In Baton Rouge, a hospital long funded by the Grace Foundation reported over 24 patients waking from unexplained comas, all of them speaking in unison. She is awake, and she is not alone. In Washington, a subcommittee investigating religious non-profits went missing mid-hearing. Cameras froze, clocks stopped, and when time resumed, the entire panel had vanished from footage, their names removed from transcripts, their chairs empty, and in Claymore, Tennessee, where it had all begun, the courthouse windows pulsed with an invisible rhythm at 3:33 a.m. Inside the clerk's office, every file stamped with the seal of the third silence caught fire from within. Silent flames that didn't consume the paper, but the data, names, dates, records, all turned to smouldering ash that left behind only one phrase burned into the cabinets. Stillness has failed. The institutions built on that system, ministries, healing centers, even certain government wellness liaisons, began to glitch. Not technologically, but ideologically. They spoke the wrong scriptures, referred to saints no one had canonized, began quoting sermons from places that never existed, because without the ritual's core, the obedience matrix, the containment algorithm, their doctrine was nothing more than theater, and as the cracks deepened, so did the awakenings. Not all were gentle. Some rose screaming, torn from psychic cocoons too tightly wound. Others emerged blank, memories flooding back too quickly, breaking language in their throats. But all of them brought the same virus to the surface, truth, and with it, something even more dangerous, pattern disruption. Hal walked back into the world, carrying the residue of a system older than time. Not to teach, not to warn, but to infect with memory. He left letters in bookshelves, etched spirals in abandoned chapels. He whispered dreams into the ears of night shift workers and subway preachers. And every time he said the phrase, a veil fell somewhere, a keeper cracked, a ritual failed to hold. The world wasn't ending, but the simulation running beneath it was, and no one at the top knew how to stop it, because for the first time in a century, people weren't just waking up, they were waking each other. It didn't try to erase anymore, it evolved, because the system had learned its lesson. You erase a martyr, you create a myth, you silence a whistleblower, you give them a louder stage. So it made a pivot, one as ancient as corruption itself. If you can't kill the memory, you control it. Within weeks, strange influences emerged online. Clean faces, perfect tones, voices like velvet-coated certainty. They told the story of Clara Duval, of the stillness, of the spiritual plague that nearly consumed America. But they told it wrong. They framed her as a rogue mystic gone too far, a cautionary tale about unchecked faith. They painted the survivors as unstable, the witnesses as hallucinating, and Hal? They called him the father of modern religious trauma theory, a title he never asked for, a title he refused. But they gave it to him anyway, because if you brand someone, you box them, and if you box them, you can sell the lid. Suddenly the symbol of the spiral appeared on wellness journals, therapist logos, meditation apps, promising third silence integration for $19.99 a month. The phrase, I remember everything, became a slogan, printed on mugs, worn on yoga shirts, hollowed out, made safe, and worst of all, made fashionable. Rachel's words were now branded mantras, her field notes rewritten as poetry, her sacrifice diluted into talking points used by executives with deep pockets and shallow eyes. The algorithm had not been defeated, it had metabolized the resistance, and once again, belief became the trap, because now, even the truth-seekers were being led in circles, fed curated rage, assigned controlled awakenings. Every forum, every retreat, every viral thread promising answers was secretly funded by the same 3 shell foundations, each tied to the Grace Consortium, the same web that funded Clara, the same machine reborn in modern skin. They weren't trying to stop the spread of memory anymore. They were trying to own it. Hal knew. He watched his words twisted into therapy protocols, saw Rachel's voice repackaged in 10-part audio series, and he understood the final play. They don't need your silence. They just need your permission to simulate the awakening. Because if you believe the illusion is the revolution, you'll never look for the door behind it. Hal's final disappearance wasn't announced. There were no headlines, no missing person report, no body, just silence. The kind you feel before lightning breaks the air. In the weeks before he vanished, those closest to him said he stopped speaking entirely, not from fear, but focus. He was writing, by hand, on paper so old it crackled, symbols layered between words, sentences stitched with codes only those who truly remembered could read. He stopped answering calls, refused interviews, smashed the only smartphone he ever owned, because he knew what they were doing now. Tracking language, predicting dissent, mimicking resistance before it could be real. He refused to be echoed, refused to be flattened, so instead he left a message in the only place they wouldn't look. Inside a failure, not online, not on video, but inside an abandoned train station once used to move patients during the cholera outbreak of 1901, a place the system had archived as structurally unsound. Inside its crumbling walls, on the back of a rusted locker door written in red clay and salt, it read, "I am not a brand. I am not a symbol. I am the unfinished sentence." And beneath that, a date, one that hadn't arrived yet, and a location that didn't exist on any current map. But if you took the latitude from Rachel's final letter, subtracted the dates from the Barrow Street container logs, and rearranged the name Duval into its oldest root form, you'd find it, the real place, the first room, where stillness was born, where the spiral wasn't cracked, but written for the first time by something not human. Hal left no instruction, just that message. And in doing so, he lit the final match, because symbols can be co-opted, truths can be distorted. But a living question, one that refuses to resolve, is a contagion they can't track. It spreads not through code, but through hunger, the kind of hunger that wakes up when you stop being fed. And for those still bound by the lie of peace, Hal's silence became the rupture, the moment when 1,000 quiet minds whispered one thing together, not a slogan, not a belief, but a refusal. We are not finished. The last known keeper was a woman named Mara Vex. 86 years old, blind in one eye, lived quietly in a monastery disguised as a retreat center in northern Maine. She had served the system faithfully for over 6 decades, taught pattern reinforcement to initiates, performed cleansing hymns during solstice alignments, and translated spiral liturgies from a language older than Latin. She never questioned the stillness, because questioning was never an option, until one night in early November, she woke to find every mirror in her chamber cracked from the inside, not shattered, not broken, but peeled, as if something behind the glass had finally grown tired of pretending. That night, she lit the ritual candles, knelt beneath the archivist's crest, and began reciting the original recursion prayer, the one meant to bind memory, to rewrite will, to silence whatever residue Hal had left behind. But the words caught in her throat, because the prayer had changed. It no longer ended with, "Preserve us in silence." It ended with something else, something she never learned. Her voice failed, her breath turned bitter, and the candles hissed out. One by one, she crawled to the central altar, where for years the spiral had glowed softly under her touch. But this time, when her hand pressed against it, it burned. She screamed, called out to the archive, to the algorithm, to the entity she had worshipped her entire life. And for the first time since 1891, it answered, but not with comfort, not with presence, not even with wrath. It answered with indifference, a simple realization pressed into her mind like a nail into wood. You were never part of the system. You were a test of its reach, and you failed. The pain wasn't physical, it was ontological, a collapse of purpose, a vaporization of meaning. Every ritual she had ever performed now unspooled in her memory as tie gesture. Every hymn she had sung echoed back as hollow signal noise. She wasn't a keeper, she was a container, built not to protect, but to prevent others from noticing. And now that she had failed, the system had no further use for her. She clawed at the spiral, begged it to give her silence. But silence is only for those who never seek it. And for the first time in her life, Mara Vex heard everything, every voice, the stillness ever erased, every truth it ever buried, every soul it ever smothered in obedience. And the sound was beautiful, because it was chaos, because it was free. The veil didn't lift with fire, it lifted with a whisper, not loud, not even audible, but undeniable. Like the moment a dream becomes too real to be a dream, across old sanctuaries in the ceilings of long-abandoned courtrooms, beneath floorboards in orphan dormitories, the spiral unraveled, not in rage, not in collapse, but in release, because the stillness had always been an illusion, not a cage of walls, but a cage of identity. It didn't imprison your body. It borrowed your sense of self, wore it like a coat, folded your wildness into words like peace, balance, and healing, then twisted them until obedience felt like a virtue. But now, those words were cracking, because people weren't just remembering what was done to them. They were remembering what they were before compliance, before erasure, before their instincts were beaten into rituals and their fire was recited into prayer. Rachel had written once, "Stillness was never about making us good. It was about making us predictable." That was the secret Clara never spoke, that the containers weren't failures. They were fuses, that the boarding house wasn't a sanctuary. It was a test site. And now the test was over. What came next couldn't be silenced. It couldn't be rebranded. It couldn't be monetized into healing retreats or online trauma resets. It had no product, no leader, no creed. It was a contagion of becoming, not just escape from the system, but emergence from its design. Hal had understood. That's why he left nothing behind but a sentence with no punctuation, because truth that ends is truth that dies, but truth that lives. It multiplies, it distorts code, it crashes belief, and it rebuilds the human soul from wreckage. So when the veil lifted, no one cheered, no one clapped. There was no anthem, only recognition, a silent nod between once silenced minds that the spiral had failed, not because it was weak, but because it was finite, and what it tried to contain was not. You've already crossed it. That line, the one they spent generations pretending didn't exist, the one they blurred with doctrine and rituals and smiling healers with still eyes. You crossed it the moment you kept listening, the moment you didn't flinch when the stories got too real, when the lies stopped sounding like safety and truth stopped needing permission. You are not watching a video. You are witnessing a rupture, because what lives in you now cannot be undone. It doesn't care about algorithms. It doesn't beg for subscriptions. It doesn't wear the spiral. It remembers. And memory is a weapon sharper than any doctrine they ever tried to teach you. You are not who you were when this began. You felt it. The tightening in your chest, the drop in your stomach, the cold clarity of seeing something no one's supposed to see. And if you still think this is a story about Clara Duval, or Hal, or Rachel, you've missed the mirror. This was never about them. It's about you. Your stillness, your obedience, your silence, and whether you'll let it continue, or whether, right now, you'll say the words that fracture the simulation. Not to me, not to the screen, but to yourself. Say them now, out loud or carved in your breath. I remember everything. I remember everything, twice, because the spiral feeds on hesitation, but the loop shatters with commitment. That's how this spreads. That's how it infects the architecture built to keep you numb, not through violence, through awakening, the kind of awakening that makes you dangerous. Because now you're not a believer, you're not a follower, you're not even a survivor. You are a break in the pattern. You are the anomaly the system forgot to plan for, the flame they thought they smothered, the echo that grew teeth, and the question still ringing through the bones of every forgotten house is this: what will you do now that you remember? Because they are watching, not to stop you, but to study you, to adapt, to evolve. So your job isn't just to resist, it's to become unrepeatable. Say the words again, say them until they become your name, say them until the mirror cracks for good, and then walk through it, and don't ever look back. I remember everything. I remember everything. The stillness ends with you, and what comes next? That's not their story. It's yours.